I see this as a wonderful opportunity to first celebrate 50 years of the National Gallery of Art's extraordinary contributions to the field of conservation, and second, reflect on how this vaunted past and present offers us a moment to reflect and also look to the future, both of the conservation field and the future of arts and cultural heritage in our national story. So to the first point, let me first offer my congratulations to the NGA and its dedicated, skilled, and generous conservation professionals, past and present. They have been at the forefront of innovative conservation practices and collections care, modeled the kinds of inspiring scholarship that are possible from interdisciplinary and collaborative technical and scientific research, trained generations of practitioners, and produced some of our field's most powerful scholarly publications. I especially want to acknowledge how generous my many colleagues and friends at the NGA have been with me personally over the years, and so I offer my warm congratulations and gratitude for your kindness, expertise, and care. That the history and present of the NGA's Conservation Department provides an extraordinary model is without doubt, and I'm grateful to have been invited to reflect on the future at its key milestone, a half century. I wish I had a way of forecasting what the future, however we define that, tomorrow, next year, the next decade, the next generation might bring. If I've learned anything in recent years, it's that the future is frustratingly ever present, just over the horizon and yet too far ahead of us to be grasped. The future is both uncertain and yet partly shaped already. It is in some ways both unchangeable and therefore perhaps hopeless, and yet tantalizingly shimmering with a sense of hope. Having recently taught an undergraduate course at my home institution of the Johns Hopkins University called Cultural Heritage in Crisis, I gained some perspective from scholars whose expertise is in scenario planning for the future. As Matt Finch and Catherine Moody remind us, the human capacity to predict the future is always limited, and institutions increasingly find themselves operating in tuna conditions. That is to say, situations characterized by turbulence, uncertainty, novelty, and ambiguity. If there's anything we've grown familiar with, if not comfortable with, it's that we operate increasingly in these tuna conditions. We are still dealing with a pandemic and a mental health crisis. Our world is at war, not just in Ukraine, but many other places. We continue to register cascading, devastating events as our climate changes. We mourn death after death from the multiple crises of gun violence, political extremism, severe economic disparities, and ongoing racial and gender injustices. And we know that these conditions have not left cultural heritage institutions, and cultural heritage practitioners unscathed. We know of the closing of arts and cultural heritage organizations, layoffs of dedicated staff, increasingly contentious disagreements about sustainable and fair wages and working conditions, quiet quitting by our fellow culture workers who've had enough, and a general disquieting sense that art is a non-essential luxury or perhaps not important at all. So in this tumultuous moment, it is not enough to say that of course art and cultural heritage matter. We cannot rest on that assumption anymore, though I would argue that that assumption should not be made at all. If we can face the difficult truth of this moment, we must acknowledge that our familiar and comfortable ways of doing things no longer are enough. Instead, we need to be able to acknowledge that we as temporary caretakers for art and cultural heritage are being tested right now. We are being asked to seriously interrogate and put forth arguments for why arts and cultural heritage matter, to whom they matter, and who should be tasked with caring for them. The fundamental question in my mind is whose future do we care about, and what are our responsibilities and commitments as culture workers, as conservators towards this future? I'd like to explore the question of whose future by returning to the work of the National Gallery of Art, whose, quote, reimagined mission, vision, and values offer us a way forward. I very much like the idea of reimagination because we have to meet this inflection point with a more expansive imagination of what conservation work could be. The future needs reimagining, a creative, flexible, even fantastical conception of what might be possible. In reading the NGA's Reimagined mission, vision, and values, I found my heart leap at a few turns of phrase, and I'd like to spend the rest of my brief time reflecting on them here. First, on the idea of exploring and experiencing art, creativity, and our shared humanity. Much of my own research focuses on searching for the presence of ancient makers on the things that they made. Many of these people have left us no names, no secure identities, and yet the undeniability of their existence, skill, and knowledge endures on their things. We're often loath to attribute creativity to ancient makers, in part because they left few descriptions of their own practices, and because the conditions under which many of them made things, be it as enslaved people, as apprentices, as unnamed individuals in a work group, makes us, as contemporary people, less likely to see them as still capable of creative acts. And yet, this is where the tools of the conservator can remind us of the fundamentally human need for creativity, most especially under difficult or dehumanizing conditions. I return to these images again and again. On the left side of a painted pot made in ancient Athens 2,500 years ago that shows two Amazons, women warriors, heading into battle. And on the right, an image captured through the computational photographic technique called reflectance transformation imaging, which allows you to see the drawings underneath the paintings. And you can just make out how these tiny curls have been drawn underneath one of the Amazon's helmets, even though they were never meant to be painted in. I see this as a moment of creativity, of delight, play, and it means even more if we consider that this pot is attributed to someone named Doris or Doris, possibly a woman, possibly an immigrant or migrant worker, one of those people whose presence in the ancient archaeological record is limited or mostly missing. Creativity, then, can be documented in a range of places on art and cultural heritage, and it's often in the small moments. And these are things we as conservators are trained to look for and explore. But we must push ourselves to search more creatively for these flashes of thrumming humanity. And we have to be ready to do the searching outside of the traditional artistic canon and the types of works and the types of artists and makers who are already vaunted as important and worth remembering. And acknowledging the availability and, in fact, the necessity of creativity for all people is the kind of humanizing work we as conservators must open-heartedly pursue, because it hasn't always been so. And we must change that, because our world and its cultural heritage is far larger than the extremely small selection of works we've thus far deemed to be of creative value. As for the NGA's vision of the nation and for all the people, as we've certainly seen in the United States in recent years, nation-making is a fraught and difficult process. I will leave aside the mechanics of nation-making and focus particularly on the phrase, for all the people. What I'd like to think about is how the conservation field can engage in practices of ongoing and long-term service and care for all the people, rather than the select few artists, patrons, communities, scholars, and specialists we tend to work with. It takes very little to notice whose works, whose heritage, and whose histories have received the majority of conservators' care and attention over many decades. Redressing this practiced and comfortable assumption of the supremacy of some art and heritage over others will take our wholehearted engagement and a willingness to be uncomfortable and give up our own sense of power. Unfortunately, many of the recent initiatives on diversity, equity, access, and inclusion have focused too much on a kind of checklist approach to changing the way that we as practitioners work. Being in service to all the people means that our efforts cannot be tied to grant cycles or what feels politically expedient. Rather, we have to believe in the worth of all the people, even if and especially when our own authority is called into question. And here, the history of our own field can serve as a reminder of our ethical commitments to people as well as the items under our care. In my research on the history of the first conservation laboratory in South India, the then Madras Government Museum, there are no fewer than 50 petitions written between the 1880s and 1947, the year of Indian independence from Britain, that record the voices of people from all over the region, demanding their right to care for the statues of their gods on their own lands and in accordance with their own traditions, rather than having them removed from their communities for preservation in the museum. As an example, I show you an image of two bronze deities acquired for the Madras Government Museum in 1936 from Mela Perambalam village. And on the right, one of these many petitions, in this case from Kannarikote village, calling upon its residents to rise up and create a local temple where bronzes planned for acquisition could be preserved in their own community and cared for by their own people. So when we see communities today calling for access, culturally relevant care, and repatriation of their own cultural heritage, we must recognize that this is nothing new. Our field has a very long history of such demands. And yet, as conservators, we've been slow to acknowledge that our training and our practices are simply our own, and that other communities have always had their own knowledge keepers and holders, their own stories, values, and meanings for their things. What might, in fact, make us more sensitive and useful in our service to all the people is to remember that we're accountable to people and their needs as much, if not more so, than to the objects we're trained to preserve. I'd like to end by taking up the phrase empathy and generosity of spirit, which the NGA counts as one of its key values, because this has significant implications for all of our futures, no matter our roles in cultural heritage. I think what art and cultural heritage and the makers of art and cultural heritage do so powerfully is to draw us into their experiences and their worlds as acts of empathy and generosity of spirit. And it takes empathy and generosity of spirit to engage with these makers on their own terms. Our world and whatever futures we might inhabit demand this mutual exchange of care, that willingness to listen, to be together in presence, to acknowledge and learn from each other's pain and sorrow, joy and creativity, resilience and hope. That's the only way to turn from the question of whose future to hope for our shared futures. Thank you.